The beast of Bray Road's gaze. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over the rural farmlands of Walworth County, Wisconsin, when the autumn harvest is done. It is not a peaceful quiet. It is a heavy, expectant stillness, broken only by the dry rustle of dead cornstalks swaying in the night wind. Out here, beyond the reach of city streetlights, the darkness is absolute. The only geometry is the straight, paved line of county highways cutting through the endless fields. For decades, the locals of Elkhorn have understood that when the fog rolls in off the fields, something else claims the night. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a subtle but undeniable shift occurred in the atmosphere of this quiet dairy community. It began as hushed conversations in the back booths of local diners, a farmer reporting an unnervingly large canine tearing into a chicken wire fence, a teenager claiming a monster chased her car down a dark stretch of gravel. At first, it was easy to dismiss these accounts as the products of overactive imaginations or too much cheap beer, but then the witnesses began to change. Reasonable, grounded individuals started coming forward. A local journalist began compiling these scattered reports, realizing they all shared chillingly specific details. Even off-duty police officers and seasoned hunters admitted to seeing something out on the lonely stretches of asphalt that defied natural explanation. They called it the Beast of Bray Road. The descriptions were terrifyingly consistent. It was not a wolf, nor was it a bear. Witnesses spoke of a creature with dark, matted fur, a broad chest, and a snout resembling a canine, yet it possessed an anatomy that allowed it to kneel, grasp, and move with a sickeningly human grace. The local lore did not paint a picture of a phantom or a ghost. It painted a picture of flesh, bone, and muscle. It was an apex predator, existing quietly in the peripheral vision of the modern world, only stepping into the light when it chose to. The true horror of Bray Road does not rely on folklore. It relies on the primal vulnerability of being utterly alone in the dark. It is a vulnerability understood entirely by those who find themselves navigating the dense, freezing fog that blankets the Wisconsin flatlands deep in the early hours of the morning. It is nearing 2:15 a.m. The air outside is cold enough to leave a thin layer of frost on the skeletal branches of the oak trees lining the roadside. A solitary car moves along the blacktop, its tires hissing against the damp asphalt. Inside, a woman grips the steering wheel, her eyes straining against the thick gray soup that reduces her visibility to a mere 20 yards. The high beams of her headlights are practically useless, reflecting off the water droplets in the air and creating a blinding white wall. She drops to her low beams, her speed decelerating to a cautious crawl. There is no radio signal out here, only the low, steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers cutting through the mist. The isolation is total. If the engine were to stall, the nearest farmhouse is miles away, its occupants long since asleep. In this enclosed space, surrounded by the vast, unseen wilderness, the car feels less like a sanctuary and more like a fragile metal cage. Up ahead, on the right shoulder of the road, a shadow bleeds through the fog. At first, it is just an indistinct mass, darker than the surrounding night. The driver taps her brakes, anticipating a stray deer or perhaps a neighbor's loose cow. As the car inches closer, the headlights begin to carve out the shape of the obstruction. It is not a cow. It is an enormous, dark figure crouched low to the ground, positioned over the mangled remains of a freshly killed white-tailed deer. The driver brings the vehicle to a complete halt, her foot pressing firmly against the brake pedal. The engine idles loudly in the dead quiet of the night. Through the glass, illuminated by the twin beams of the halogen headlights, the scene unfolds with horrifying clarity. The creature's back is turned to the car. Thick, coarse fur, the color of wet ash and charcoal, covers a torso that is impossibly broad. Heavy muscles ripple beneath its coat as it tears into the carcass. The sound is muffled by the closed windows, but the violent, jerky movements of the creature's head leave no doubt as to what it is doing. Large, clawed hands, bearing a sickening resemblance to human fingers, grip the deer's rib cage to hold it steady. A rational mind desperately searches for a comforting explanation. It must be a grizzly bear that wandered hundreds of miles out of its territory, or an abnormally large mutated wolf. But the proportions are entirely wrong. The shoulders are tapered like a weightlifter's, the arms too long and heavily articulated. A cold, heavy knot of dread tightens in the driver's stomach. Her breath hitches, clouding the cold glass of her side window. She knows she should press the accelerator and speed past, but her body is paralyzed by a deeply ingrained ancestral terror. She is a witness to something that should not exist. Then, the creature registers the presence of the car. It stops feeding. The sudden stillness is worse than the violent movement. The beast drops a torn piece of flesh onto the damp asphalt. Slowly, with a deliberate and terrifying grace, it begins to rise. It does not stay on all fours like a startled animal preparing to flee. Instead, it pushes off the ground, its powerful hind legs straightening. The joints pop and crack with sickening volume, audible even over the idling engine. The creature unfolds itself, rising up and up, towering over the hood of the car. It stands firmly on two legs, reaching a height of well over 7 feet. Its sheer mass blocks out the white line painted on the edge of the road. The beast turns its head to face the vehicle. The headlights illuminate a terrifying visage. A long, dark snout, drawn back in a subtle sneer, reveals teeth stained crimson with fresh blood. Pointed ears sit high on a lupine skull, but the true nightmare lies in its eyes. They are a luminescent, pale amber, catching the artificial light and reflecting it back into the fog. The horror of the moment does not stem from a roar or a feral lunge toward the glass. The monster does not act like a cornered beast running on blind instinct. Instead, it simply stares. It stares through the windshield, past the glare of the headlights, looking directly into the terrified eyes of the woman behind the wheel. The gaze is calculating. It is an expression of deep, predatory intelligence. The creature recognizes the metal machine for what it is, and more importantly, it recognizes the soft, fragile human trapped inside it. There is a silent communication in that unblinking stare, an understanding of absolute dominance. It is deciding, in real time, whether to let her live. Time loses all meaning in the heavy, suffocating silence. The beast's chest rises and falls with deep, measured breaths. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, the creature dismisses her. It turns its massive shoulders away from the light, takes one long, fluid step over the guardrail, and melts seamlessly into the dense, fog-choked woods. The darkness swallows it whole, leaving only the mutilated remains of the deer on the shoulder as proof that the encounter was not a hallucination. The driver slams her foot onto the gas pedal, the tires screech against the pavement, struggling for traction before launching the car forward into the night. She does not look in the rearview mirror. She drives until the fuel tank is nearly empty, long after the rural roads have given way to the safety of sodium streetlights and civilization. The Elkhorn police logs from those years are filled with similar reports. Stunned drivers stumbling into the station, their faces pale, their hands shaking as they try to describe a nightmare that walked on two legs. Skeptics continue to write off the Bray Road beast as misidentified bears, large dogs, or a mass sociological delusion. But those who have driven down that isolated stretch of blacktop in the dead of night know the truth. They know that when the fog rolls in and the temperature drops, the woods harbor ancient, intelligent predators. And they know that if you find yourself stopped on the edge of a cornfield, caught in the pale glow of amber eyes, your survival is entirely dependent on a monster's mercy. The Phantom Vehicles of Route 491. There is a stretch of asphalt that bleeds through the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, a desolate ribbon cutting across the Navajo Nation. It is a place of striking, barren beauty by day, characterized by jagged red rock formations and oceans of pale sagebrush. But when the sun drops below the horizon, the landscape changes. The temperature plummets, shadows stretch into unnatural shapes, and the isolation becomes absolute. This is Route 491. For nearly 8 decades, however, it carried a different designation, one that seemed to infect the very earth beneath the pavement. It was known as Route 666, the Devil's Highway. Commissioned in 1926 as the sixth spur of the legendary Route 66, the highway was burdened with a numeric association that immediately cast a shadow over its creation. For years, engineers and locals alike brushed off the designation as a mere administrative coincidence, but the road quickly earned a reputation soaked in blood and unexplained terror. The accident statistics on that endless, straight stretch of desert highway were consistently impossibly high. Fatalities occurred on clear days with dry roads and perfect visibility. Cars were found crushed along the shoulder with no evidence of another vehicle involved, no tire marks indicating a sudden swerve, and no logical explanation for the trauma inflicted upon the twisted metal. In May of 2003, state officials finally bowed to public pressure and indigenous leaders who argued the number was a cursed relic. The highway signs were replaced, Route 666 became Route 491. The politicians and highway patrol supervisors hoped that scrubbing the mark of the beast from the map would purge the highway of its dark legacy. They believed new metal signs would bring safety. But the land does not care about human administration. The geography remained unchanged, and the road continued to collect its toll in the dead of night. The local folklore of the Navajo has always warned against lingering in this territory after dark. There are hushed stories of skinwalkers, dark entities capable of taking animal form, keeping pace with vehicles traveling at 70 miles per hour. There are accounts of pale, featureless faces pressing against passenger windows in the middle of a desolate run. But among those who drive heavy freight for a living, there is a different, more mechanical terror. It is the legend of the phantom rigs, massive black trucks that hunt on the endless straightaways, leaving no trace but the wreckage of those they force off the road. To understand the dread, one must understand the environment. Picture a lone commercial driver hauling a heavy payload through the vast emptiness near the border of Utah and Colorado. The time is exactly 3 a.m. This is the hour when the human body begs for sleep, when the mind begins to play tricks, and when the veil between reality and nightmares wears dangerously thin. The driver sits high in the cab of an 18-wheeler, surrounded by the monotonous hum of diesel power and the relentless drone of heavy tires on cold asphalt. Beyond the reach of the headlights, the world ceases to exist. There are no streetlights, there are no distant farmhouses glowing in the dark. There is only the yellow center line flashing past, a hypnotic metronome marking the passage of time through a void. The cabin temperature is warm, yet a deep chill seems to radiate from the glass of the windshield. The driver reaches for the radio dial, seeking the comfort of a late-night broadcast or the chatter of another trucker on the citizens' band. The radio offers nothing. The steady signal of a distant country music station abruptly warps, the music bending out of tune before dissolving entirely. It is replaced by a thick, heavy hiss of static. The driver turns the dial, scanning through the frequencies. Every channel yields the same dense, aggressive white noise. Even the emergency channel is dead. The electronic isolation mirrors the physical isolation. The truck is a lone island of steel moving through a sea of black sand and stone. It is then that the driver checks the side mirror. Far in the distance, swallowed by the immense dark of the highway, twin points of light appear. They are headlights, burning with an intense, unnatural halogen glare. At first, they are a minor detail, just another traveler sharing the lonely road. But within a matter of seconds, the lights grow significantly larger. The distance is closing at a rate that defies the physics of a heavy vehicle. The driver checks the speedometer. The 18-wheeler is pushing 75 miles per hour. Yet, the lights in the mirror are approaching as if the driver's rig is parked on the shoulder. The driver grips the steering wheel tighter, expecting the violent rush of wind and the deafening roar of a modified engine as the reckless vehicle overtakes. A massive rig moving at that speed displaces a massive amount of air. It commands a physical presence, but as the blinding headlights fill the entirety of the side mirrors, turning the interior of the cab a stark, clinical white, there is no sound. The silence is the first true indicator of the nightmare. The driver's own diesel engine continues to hum, but from the approaching vehicle, there is absolute quiet, no grinding of heavy gears. No roar of a supercharged engine, no heavy tires screaming against the asphalt. The massive shape pulls out from behind, gliding into the opposing lane to pass. The driver glances out the driver's side window, preparing to curse the reckless operator. Instead, the words die in the throat. The vehicle pulling alongside is another tractor-trailer, but it is deeply wrong. It is a colossal machine painted in a matte black so absolute that it seems to absorb the faint ambient light of the moon. There is no chrome trim, there are no reflective safety strips, there is no company logo painted on the side of the trailer. It is a silhouette of pure, heavy darkness given physical form, moving silently at an impossible speed. The phantom truck aligns itself perfectly with the driver's rig. They are moving parallel, hurtling through the desert night side by side. The driver looks across the narrow gap between the two massive machines, peering up into the cab of the black truck. The interior of the phantom rig is not lit by dashboard dials or a soft overhead light. It is pitch black. Yet, the driver's eyes adjust just enough to perceive the horrifying truth. The heavy leather seat is empty. There is no one behind the wheel. The massive steering column remains perfectly still, yet the truck maintains a flawless trajectory. There is no driver, no human element controlling this tons of hurtling steel. It is an empty vessel, operating with a malicious, independent will. Before the driver can fully process the impossible sight, the black truck begins to drift. It does not swerve violently, it moves with a slow, deliberate, and crushing intent. The phantom rig crosses the yellow center line, invading the driver's lane. The sheer mass of the black truck forces the driver to adjust the steering wheel, edging the 18-wheeler toward the right. The right side tires hit the rumble strip. The sudden, violent vibration shakes the cab, a desperate mechanical warning. The asphalt here is narrow. Beyond the thin shoulder lies a steep, crumbling embankment leading down into the dark, jagged ravines that line this section of Route 491. The phantom truck continues its silent push. It does not scrape against the driver's vehicle. There is no spark of colliding metal, only an oppressive, magnetic pressure forcing the living driver further out of the lane. The driver slams on the air brakes. The massive tires lock, screaming in protest as the heavy rig fights to shed speed. Plumes of acrid blue smoke erupt from the wheel wells. The truck bucks and shudders, the trailer threatening to jackknife as the rear wheels slide perilously close to the edge of the abyss. The world becomes a chaotic blur of vibration, the smell of burning rubber, and the terrifying pull of gravity toward the unseen canyon floor. As the driver's rig finally grinds to a violent halt, the front right tire resting mere inches from a fatal drop, the driver looks up. The black truck has not slowed down. It has not merged back into the lane, it simply continues its forward trajectory, the blinding red glow of its taillights fading into the distance. Then, in the blink of an eye, the red lights extinguish. The massive black shape dissolves into the desert night. There is no sound of an engine fading into the distance, there is no dust trail. The phantom vehicle simply ceases to be, leaving behind nothing but the cold, vast emptiness of the highway. The driver sits trembling in the frozen cab, hands fused to the steering wheel, chest heaving with shallow breaths. The radio crackles to life, the static abruptly replaced by the clear, sharp twang of a guitar from a distant station. The natural world has returned. But as the driver looks down past the hood of the truck into the yawning blackness of the ravine, a sickening realization takes hold. Down in the depths of those canyons, hidden by the shadows and the jagged rocks, lie the rusted, twisted frames of vehicles that never made it home. They belong to the drivers who did not wake up in time, the ones who did not hit the brakes fast enough when the empty black rigs silently pushed them over the edge. Route 491 may have a new sign, but the pavement remains stained with the past, and the isolated night still belongs to the things that hunt on the Devil's Highway. The Midnight Choir of Waverly Hills. On a high wooded ridge in southwestern Louisville, Kentucky, a decaying Gothic monolith bleeds into the night sky. Waverly Hills Sanatorium stands as a sprawling, bat-winged fortress of dark brick and shattered glass. The structure is massive, dominating the landscape with a heavy, oppressive stillness. It is a place where time ceased to move decades ago, yet the physical residue of immense human suffering never truly evaporated from its halls. The wind that pulls through the empty window frames does not merely whistle, it wheezes, dragging across the cracked plaster like breath through a ruined trachea. To understand the atmosphere of Waverly Hills is to understand the White Plague. In the early 20th century, tuberculosis was a death sentence that arrived as a slow, suffocating thief. By 1926, the massive 5-story sanatorium was opened to accommodate the overwhelming tide of the afflicted. It was designed as an island of quarantine, a place where the sick were sent to either recover through experimental fresh air therapies or, far more often, to die in isolation. Patients were subjected to brutal treatments, ribs were surgically removed to collapse infected lungs, and heavy sandbags were placed on chests. The sheer volume of mortality was staggering. It is estimated that up to 60,000 souls took their final, agonizing breaths within these walls. The bodies became so numerous that a motorized cable system was installed in a concrete tunnel stretching 400 feet down the hill. This became known as the body chute, a grim artery designed to transport the dead away quietly, out of sight of the living whose morale was already fracturing. Today, the building is a hollow shell, stripped of its medical equipment and abandoned to the elements. Yet, those who are tasked with walking its long, cavernous corridors at night understand that Waverly Hills is not empty. It is saturated. The caretakers and night guards who patrol the sprawling wards do not speak of traditional hauntings. They do not report transparent figures in period clothing. Instead, they describe a terrifying environmental playback, a phenomenon where the building itself seems to regurgitate the sensory horrors of its past. The auditory terror usually begins deep in the night, often reported around 2:30 a.m., when the ambient noise of the surrounding city has completely faded. A lone guard walking the central corridor of the 4th floor will first notice a severe drop in air pressure. The atmosphere grows heavy, thick with a metallic scent that closely resembles old dried copper. It is the distinct, unmistakable smell of blood. The temperature plummets rapidly, mimicking the cold, damp sweat of a breaking fever. Then, the silence is broken by a single, wet sound. It starts as a low, guttural click at the far end of the pitch-black hallway, a sharp intake of air followed by a wet, heavy cough. The sound is highly localized, echoing off the peeling lead paint and the chipped terrazzo floors. It sounds exactly like a human being struggling to clear a massive obstruction from their throat. Before the mind can rationalize the sound as a trick of the wind or settling pipes, a second cough joins in from an adjacent empty room. Then a third, emanating from the shadows directly behind the listener. Within moments, the isolated sounds cascade into a horrific symphony. It is a phenomenon known among the night staff as the midnight choir. Dozens, then hundreds of invisible throats begin to spasm simultaneously. It is the terrible, unmistakable sound of the death rattle, the final stage of respiratory failure, where fluid pools in the lungs and the failing throat loses its ability to swallow. The acoustics of the long, tiled corridors amplify the noise until it becomes a deafening roar. It is the sound of an entire hospital ward drowning on dry land. Caretakers have reported dropping to their knees, clutching their ears to block out the overwhelming auditory assault of hundreds of phantom patients choking on their own dissolving lungs. The noise vibrates in the sternum. It feels entirely physical, a crushing wave of collective agony that demands to be heard. It is during this crescendo of auditory panic that the visual terror manifests. The human brain, overwhelmed by the deafening sound of unseen suffocation, frantically commands the eyes to search for the source. The beam of a heavy flashlight cuts through the dust-moated air, sweeping wildly across the empty beds and the graffiti-stained walls. But the threat does not walk on the floor. High above, pressed flat against the decaying ceiling plaster, a shape detaches itself from the darkness. It is an entity known only in the whispered lore of the property as the Creeper. The flashlight beam reveals a sprawling, ink-black silhouette roughly the size of a human, but its proportions are entirely wrong. Its limbs are elongated, spindly, and bent at impossible spider-like angles. It defies gravity, clinging to the smooth ceiling above the hallway with an unnatural tension. The Creeper does not float. It crawls. It moves with the rapid, twitching locomotion of an insect, scuttling across the ceiling tiles at a terrifying speed. As the choir of choking patients echoes endlessly through the ward, the shadowed entity darts from archway to archway, using the deep corners of the high ceilings to mask its approach. It makes no sound of its own, fully concealed by the deafening roar of the phantom coughing. Witnesses describe a paralyzing sense of predatory intent radiating from the shape. It descends the walls only to reposition itself, moving so fast that the eye can barely track its progression before it melds back into the blackness above. It is a manifestation of pure, predatory dread, feeding off the residual energy of the suffering that permeates the brickwork. Those who encounter the midnight choir and the crawling shadow do not investigate further. The only rational response is retreat. Guards report backing away slowly, keeping their flashlight beams trained on the ceiling until they reach the heavy steel doors of the main stairwell. The descent down the concrete steps is always frantic, driven by the suffocating need to escape the heavy, diseased air of the upper floors. The sounds of the collective death rattle only begin to muffle once the heavy exterior doors are pushed open, allowing the freezing night air of the Kentucky woods to hit the face. But the silence outside never truly erases the experience. The trauma of the encounter lingers long after the shift ends. Those who walk the halls of Waverly Hills learn a grim reality about the nature of a haunting. The sanatorium is not simply a structure occupied by restless spirits. It is a massive architectural phonograph needle permanently stuck in the deepest groove of human agony, playing back the horrific reality of the White Plague to anyone unfortunate enough to listen in the dark. A man disappeared while his friends watched, and no one can explain how. On a mild Saturday in late September, 3 friends drove from Brevard into Pisgah National Forest for a short hike. They returned without Jonah Mercer, and none of them agreed on the same timeline afterward. Dispatch logs show the first call came before sunset, reported as a missing adult near a well-known trail junction. By the time rangers arrived, the story had already started to split into versions. Jonah Mercer was 31, an IT support specialist in Asheville, and he'd been training for a charity half marathon. His friends were Ethan Rowe, 33, a diesel mechanic, and Paige Landry, 29, a nursing assistant at a regional clinic. County file from 2009 lists Ethan as a volunteer searcher in an older missing case, which later mattered. Archived notes suggest Paige was the one who picked the route, a familiar loop near a creek. They parked near Brevard and started walking after lunch, according to a statement later summarized in state records. The plan was simple: reach a viewpoint, eat, then return before the temperature dropped. Reportedly, Jonah carried a small day pack, a rain shell, and a phone with a partially charged battery. Ethan carried a basic first aid kit, and Paige brought 2 water bottles and a headlamp. The trail that day was not empty, and multiple hikers later told investigators they saw the trio pass. One witness recalled Jonah laughing, and another remembered Paige pointing at a posted map. Investigators never confirmed the exact minute they reached the creek crossing because records conflict across interviews. Still, the statements match on one detail: Jonah was behind them by only a few steps. At the creek, the three paused on flat rocks where the water spread into shallow channels. Ethan later said Jonah stepped onto a stone that shifted, then hopped back onto dry ground. Paige later said Jonah never slipped, and she insisted he was calm and joking. Both agreed. They stopped for maybe a minute, listening for other hikers behind them. Then both claimed Jonah moved toward a patch of brush beside the waterline. What happened next is the part that never stabilized, even after formal interviews. Ethan told a deputy that Jonah took 3 steps into the brush, then disappeared like he'd walked through a curtain. Paige told a ranger Jonah turned his shoulders as if he heard someone call him from upstream. Investigators never confirmed any additional voice, and no other witness reported shouting near the crossing. The county file notes the phrase "watched him vanish," but it is followed by a question mark. In the first 911 call, reportedly made by Paige, she said her friend had wandered off trail and was not responding. In a second call, minutes later, Ethan said Jonah was right there, and then he wasn't, and he sounded shaken. Dispatch logs show the operator asked if Jonah might be injured, and both callers answered they didn't know. Records conflict on whether the callers described the brush as thick or sparse, which later shaped search patterns. A ranger unit arrived from Brevard and started at the creek crossing with 2 volunteers. State records list the initial weather as clear, with damp ground near the water and no heavy wind. A tracking dog was requested, but an archive note says the handler was an hour away. Paige and Ethan were kept on the trail, and they were told not to move through the brush. They both complied, according to the first incident report. The earliest photos in the file show flat stones, low rhododendron, and a narrow path where someone had stepped. Investigators never confirmed those prints were Jonah's because the area had foot traffic that afternoon. Some locals claimed the creek area had confusing side paths, but trail maintenance records show no reroute in that season. The ranger report mentions a faint odor of smoke from a distant campsite, and that detail later fed rumors. A deputy from Transylvania County arrived and took separate statements in the parking area. The deputy noted Ethan's hands were scraped, which Ethan said came from grabbing branches while calling Jonah's name. Paige had wet pant cuffs, and she said she stepped into the creek while looking upstream. Both said Jonah had no reason to leave the trail, and both insisted he wasn't intoxicated. Investigators never confirmed any alcohol use, and no containers were found in their gear. As daylight faded, searchers expanded along the creek, then up 2 short ridges on either side. A state records entry lists 1 volunteer hearing a single whistle, then nothing further. That volunteer could not confirm the direction, and no other team heard it. Some locals claimed whistles were common on weekends, used by hikers to locate companions. Investigators never confirmed a whistle tied to Jonah, and it remains a disputed detail. A tracking dog arrived after dark and worked near the stones for several minutes. The handler reportedly told a ranger the dog showed interest near the water, then lost the trail abruptly. Archive notes caution that running water can confuse scent, especially with multiple people moving nearby. The dog then circled a cluster of rhododendron and stopped, refusing to push farther. Investigators never confirmed whether that behavior indicated scent loss or simple fatigue. By midnight, the search included volunteers from nearby counties and a small thermal drone team. The drone footage, summarized in a later memo, showed no heat source consistent with an adult body in open terrain. Dense canopy, limited visibility, and the creek corridor produced pockets of false readings from wet rock. The memo also notes that Jonah's phone did not ping reliably in that drainage. Records conflict on whether a brief signal was detected around 10:30, but it could not be repeated. The next morning, the operation shifted to daylight grid searches with teams assigned to map squares. State records list the command post near Brevard, and the incident commander requested a helicopter if weather stayed clear. A volunteer team found a torn piece of snack wrapper near the crossing, but investigators never confirmed it belonged to Jonah. Another team reported finding a fresh scuff on a rock face, though photos did not settle the question. The county file calls these items non-probative, meaning they proved little either way. Ethan and Paige were interviewed again, this time with a ranger investigator present. Ethan said he watched Jonah's back, then Jonah stepped behind a bush and never reappeared. Paige said she watched Jonah's feet, and she claimed his shoes stayed visible until they didn't. Investigators never confirmed how a person could vanish within that line of sight, but they also noted stress distorts memory. Records conflict on the distance, with estimates ranging from 5 feet to 15. A third witness emerged on day 2, a hiker from Hendersonville who said he passed the trio earlier. He told investigators Jonah asked about the creek crossing, and he mentioned slippery stones. That hiker later said he heard shouting around dusk, then saw 2 people waving on the trail. Dispatch logs support that there was yelling, but they do not describe content. Investigators never confirmed the witness saw Jonah after the crossing, and his account ends before the disappearance window. On day 3, search teams focused downstream, where a fall could carry a body into brushy bends. Divers were not initially used because water depth was low and visibility was poor. Archive notes include a discussion about sudden sinkholes, but geology maps showed no known collapse feature at that site. Some locals claimed there were old logging pits nearby, covered by leaves and moss. Investigators never confirmed any pit close enough to explain the sightline problem. The sheriff's office requested Jonah's phone records, and a limited summary appears in a state records appendix. It shows brief activity earlier that afternoon, then no outgoing calls after the hike began. There was a single unsent text draft, reportedly typed around 3, that read almost like a reminder. Investigators never confirmed Jonah wrote it, because drafts can persist from earlier days. The phone itself was never recovered, so the data remains partial. A week later, the case shifted from rescue to recovery, a change reflected in county file language. The incident commander wrote that probability of survival had dropped due to exposure risk and lack of contact. Yet the weather had been mild, and that fact kept the case from closing emotionally. Some locals claimed Jonah was seen at a gas station in Brevard days later, but investigators never confirmed the report. The tip was logged, then marked unfounded, with no surveillance match. Attention turned to Ethan and Paige not as suspects in a crime, but as sources of inconsistent detail. They had been close friends with Jonah for years, and there was no reported conflict on the drive. Still, investigators asked about finances, relationships, and any reason Jonah might stage a disappearance. Both denied any motive, and neither had recent legal trouble in state records. Investigators never confirmed any plan to leave, and Jonah had upcoming work shifts on the calendar. A small detail in archived notes became a recurring point. Jonah's shoes were described differently in 2 interviews. Ethan said trail runners with bright soles, and Paige said hiking shoes, darker and heavier. Records conflict on which description matched photos Jonah posted online weeks earlier. Investigators never confirmed what he wore that day because no clear pre-hike photo existed. Some locals claimed a shoe was found months later, but the county file shows no tagged evidence entry for it. In early October, a ranger documented faint drag marks near a narrow chute leading away from the creek. The marks could have been made by deer, dogs, or human boots, and the report uses reportedly more than once. A team followed the chute to a steep bank, then stopped at exposed rock and scattered leaf litter. No blood was found, and no torn cloth was recovered in that segment. Investigators never confirmed the drag marks were related, and later rains erased them. A wildlife theory was raised quietly, then discussed in a later memorandum. Black bears are present in Pisgah, and there have been incidents, though they are uncommon. The memo notes no signs of a struggle, no scent indications from the dog, and no confirmed animal tracks at the crossing. Some locals claimed the area had aggressive boars, but wildlife officers did not confirm that pattern. Investigators never confirmed predation, and the file avoids stating it as a likely cause. Another theory involved a medical event, a sudden seizure, cardiac issue, or fainting spell near unstable ground. Jonah had no known condition in the limited medical history shared, according to the family's statement. Still, a fall into shallow water can produce disorientation, and a person can move unpredictably in panic. Investigators never confirmed a fall because the stones showed no definitive impact mark. Records conflict on whether Jonah's clothes were wet before he stepped toward the brush. Months later, a volunteer found a water bottle wedged between rocks downstream, and it was logged as potential evidence. The label was common, and no fingerprints were usable, according to a brief note. The bottle's location could fit the creek theory, yet it could also reflect ordinary litter. Some locals claimed the bottle was Jonah's because the cap color matched Page's description. Investigators never confirmed ownership, and the item did not change search posture. In 2020, the sheriff's office reviewed the case file and added a summary page for archival storage. That page notes the disappearance occurred within sight, yet no corroborating witness confirmed the moment. It lists key uncertainties, the dog's abrupt scent loss, inconsistent footwear descriptions, and unverified reports of later sightings. The summary avoids conclusions, and it ends with a line about records conflict. Jonah Mercer remains missing, and the creek crossing remains the last confirmed location in state records. Years later, hikers still mention the story in Brevard cafes, usually in lowered voices and with careful qualifiers. Some locals claimed the forest takes people, but investigators never confirmed anything beyond a missing adult. Dispatch logs, state records, archive notes, and the county file from 2009 all circle the same hard fact. Two friends said they watched a man step away and they could not explain how he failed to come back. The file stays open because the evidence never becomes final. Attacked at the Sallie House. The limestone walls of Atchison, Kansas hold a coldness that the prairie sun cannot reach. In this small town where the Missouri River winds like a slow, dark ribbon, stands a modest brick house on North 2nd Street. To a passing stranger, it looks like a relic of the late 19th century, sturdy, unassuming, and quiet. But the air around the property feels heavy, as if the oxygen has been replaced by the weight of a 100-year-old secret. Inside, the shadows do not behave according to the laws of light. They cling to the corners of the ceiling, and they watch. They are waiting for a specific kind of guest. They are waiting for the men. The legend of the Sallie House is not one of a vengeful widow or a spectral soldier, but of a child. According to the documented lore of the town, the haunting traces back to a young girl named Sally who died on the operating table in the front room of this very house. In the early 1900s, the home served as the residence and office of a local physician. Sally was brought there by her frantic mother, suffering from a severe case of appendicitis. The doctor, fearing the organ would rupture, did not wait for the anesthesia to take full effect. Sally's final moments in the world of the living were defined by the cold bite of a scalpel and a blinding, white-hot agony. She died believing the man trying to save her was the man who was torturing her. For decades, the house remained relatively quiet, a slumbering vessel for a trauma that refused to dissipate. It wasn't until the early 1990s that the house truly woke up. A young couple, Tony and Deborah Pickman, moved into the residence, unaware that they were stepping into a territorial battleground. From the very first night, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature would plummet in the nursery, dropping 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. Strange smells, the metallic scent of blood, and the sterile odor of old medicine would waft through the hallways. But the entity in the house wasn't interested in Deborah. It had fixed its sights on Tony. The escalation began with subtle pranks. Objects would move across the kitchen table when Tony was alone. He would hear the soft, rhythmic patter of small feet running across the floorboards upstairs, followed by a giggle that sounded less like a child and more like a warning. Then came the physical contact. It started as a phantom touch, a cold hand brushing against his neck in the middle of the night. But as the weeks passed, the touch turned violent. The spirit of the little girl, or whatever was masquerading as her, began to manifest a visceral, burning hatred for the man of the house. During one dinner, while friends were visiting, Tony felt a sharp, stinging sensation across his back. He pulled up his shirt to reveal three long, bright red welts, as if a small hand with jagged nails had raked across his skin. There was no explanation. He hadn't been near anything sharp. The marks were fresh, weeping, and hot to the touch. This became the Sally house's signature. It was no longer a haunting of sightings and sounds. It was a haunting of physical assault. The entity was marking him, claiming his flesh as a canvas for its eternal resentment of the doctor who had failed it. One evening, at approximately 10:15 p.m., the activity reached a terrifying crescendo. Tony was in the basement, a dark, damp space with a dirt floor that seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight. The air down there was thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. He felt a sudden, oppressive pressure on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He tried to turn back toward the stairs, but his feet felt heavy, as if he were walking through waist-deep water. Then, the burning started. It wasn't just a scratch this time. It felt like someone had pressed a branding iron against his torso. He cried out, stumbling toward the light of the kitchen above. When he reached the safety of the living room and lifted his shirt, his wife gasped. Across his chest were dozens of scratches, crisscrossing in a chaotic pattern. Some were thin and shallow, while others were deep enough to bead with blood. They formed a frantic, angry map of pain. As they watched, new marks began to appear in real time, appearing under the skin like invisible ink being heated by a flame. There was no one near him. The room was empty of anyone living, yet Tony was being shredded by unseen fingers. The horror angle of the Sally house is the realization that the entity isn't just a confused child. Investigators who have spent nights in the house describe a dual presence. There is the girl, Sally, who is often seen in a pinafore dress clutching a teddy bear, but behind her, or perhaps using her image as a mask, is something much older and more sinister. This darker force thrives on the fear of men. It watches from the top of the stairs, a shadow taller than any man, with eyes that do not reflect light. When male visitors enter the nursery, they often report a feeling of intense nausea, followed by the unmistakable sensation of being watched by something that wants to tear the skin from their bones. One investigator in the mid-90s recounted a session at 3 a.m. in the nursery. He sat in the center of the room with a tape recorder, asking questions into the silence. He felt a sudden icy breeze pass through his hair. He joked nervously about the cold, trying to maintain his composure. Within seconds, he felt a violent shove against his shoulder that nearly knocked him off his chair. When he looked at his arm, he found a circular bruise already forming, the size of a small child's palm, but with a strength that suggested a muscular, adult force. The audio recording from that night captured a low, guttural growl that no human throat could produce, followed by a child's voice whispering a single word, "Get out." The house has a way of isolating its victims. Even when the room is full of people, the man being targeted feels as though he is in a void. The sounds of the outside world, the cars on North 2nd Street, the wind in the trees fade into a muffled hum. All that remains is the sound of his own heartbeat and the realization that he is being hunted in a space that should be a sanctuary. The scratches often appear in sets of 3, a mockery of the Holy Trinity that is common in demonic hauntings, suggesting that the little girl may be a facade for something far more predatory. By the time the Pickmans finally fled the house, Tony's body was a map of scars. He had suffered over 20 documented physical attacks. The scratches would often heal with unnatural speed, disappearing within 24 hours, only to be replaced by new ones the moment he stepped back across the threshold. The psychological toll was even greater. He began to have dreams of the operating table, feeling the phantom slice of the doctor's knife, experiencing the terror of a child who realizes the person meant to help them is the one causing the pain. Today, the Sally house remains a site of pilgrimage for those who wish to test their bravery, but the warnings remain unchanged. Women and children often walk through the rooms with nothing more than a slight chill or a sense of sadness. But for the men who dare to enter, the experience is different. They speak of a lingering dread that follows them home, a feeling of being marked. Some have reported finding scratches on their backs days after leaving Atchison, as if the entity had hitched a ride, waiting until they were vulnerable in their own beds to remind them of its presence. The house stands silent now, its dark windows reflecting the Kansas sky. But if you stand on the sidewalk long enough after the sun goes down, you might see a small shadow move past the upstairs window. You might hear the faint sound of a girl crying, or the heavy, rhythmic thud of something much larger pacing the floorboards. The limestone walls remember the screams of 1906, and the entity inside remembers the face of every man who has ever entered its domain. It is a house that does not forgive, and it is a house that never forgets the feel of skin beneath its claws. A search helicopter refused to fly over this section of forest. In late October of 2019, a search team in Josephine County watched a helicopter turn away from dark timber. They had a missing man, fresh tracks, and a weather window that should have helped. Reportedly, the pilot came on the radio and refused one specific drainage by name. Dispatch logs show the denial happened twice, minutes apart, with ground units already staged nearby. Records conflict on why it happened, and that gap became the center of the case. Evan Carver was 34, a contract survey technician from Medford, working a short job outside Grants Pass that week. He spent his days marking property corners, then hiking after work to clear his head. On Friday afternoon, he drove toward the Rogue River area with a small pack and one headlamp. A coworker later told investigators Evan planned a quick loop, then dinner back in town. State records show his phone last pinged near Mrballen, then went silent without further network hits. The county file from 2009 lists that drainage as rugged, with steep benches and confusing game trails. A second person matters because Evan did not start alone, at least not according to archived notes. Maya Lopez was 29, a pharmacy tech from Grants Pass, and she had met Evan through friends months earlier. She reportedly joined him for the first mile, then turned back after a knee flare-up. Her statement stayed consistent on time, but investigators never confirmed her exact turnaround point. She said Evan kept going, calm and unhurried, and promised to text when he reached the car again. Dispatch logs later show responders considered her the last reliable witness, yet records conflict on whether she walked partway again. The first call came from a small market clerk in Mrballen who noticed Evan's truck still parked after closing. A deputy checked the area around 10 p.m., then filed a welfare note rather than a missing report. By sunrise, Maya had called twice, reportedly crying, and asked that a search be started. County radio traffic shows the report was upgraded mid-morning after a K9 handler found fresh scent near a faint footpath. Some locals claimed they saw a lone headlamp deeper in the trees around midnight, though investigators never confirmed that sighting. The first official search grid began before noon, with volunteers arriving from Grants Pass and Cave Junction. Terrain became the immediate problem, according to state records and archive notes from prior rescues. The area was a patchwork of private timber, BLM land, and steep ravines cut by seasonal creeks. The ground team found boot impressions in soft duff, then lost them on rock slabs near a narrow draw. A handler reportedly said the dog pulled hard downhill, then circled and stalled near thick vine maple. Investigators wrote that wind shifted sharply in that pocket and scent could have pooled or vanished. Even so, they requested an air asset, expecting a quick infrared sweep before clouds moved in. The helicopter arrived from a nearby base in the afternoon, with a pilot and a crew member trained for rescue support. Dispatch logs show the aircraft made 2 passes over the broader valley, then angled toward the drainage where the dog had signaled. The refusal happened while the aircraft was still high, before any obvious hazard was called from the ground. Reportedly, the pilot said, "I'm not flying over that section today," and asked for an alternate route. Ground supervisors pressed for clarification, but the radio exchange stayed brief and tense. In one archived note, a sergeant wrote that the pilot sounded certain, as if repeating a policy rather than making a judgment. Records conflict on whether the crew member tried to add details because the audio file is incomplete. After the refusal, ground teams adjusted their plan and pushed harder into the drainage on foot. They moved in pairs, marking tape and calling Evan's name at set intervals. A volunteer later told a reporter the woods felt normal until they crossed an invisible line, then everything went still. That description never appeared in the official narrative, and investigators did not endorse it. Dispatch logs do show radio discipline tightened at that moment, with fewer casual transmissions. Some locals claimed the silence came from an old marijuana grow area, but county deputies never confirmed active sites during that weekend. At dusk, one team found a water bottle that matched Evan's brand preference, according to Maya's interview. It sat upright on a flat rock beside a trickle of water with no dirt on the cap. Searchers photographed it, bagged it, and logged the location for follow-up in daylight. State records show no usable fingerprints were recovered, which can happen outdoors for mundane reasons. Still, the placement raised questions because it looked deliberate rather than dropped. Investigators wrote that Evan could have paused there, then continued into thicker cover. The dog was brought back to that point, reportedly showing interest, then pulling again toward the same forbidden drainage. Morning brought low clouds and a cold drizzle, yet conditions were still workable for short aviation windows. The incident commander asked again for air support, and the same helicopter crew was available. Dispatch logs show a second refusal, again tied to the same small section of forest. This time, the pilot referenced wind and turbulence, yet weather reports from nearby stations showed moderate gusts, not extreme. Records conflict because a volunteer spotter reported calmer air at ridgeline, while the pilot described sudden downdrafts. Investigators never confirmed with flight data since that information was not attached to the county file. Ground teams were told to continue without aerial coverage, stretching resources across a wider grid. Maya remained at the staging area, answering questions and checking her phone for any new message. She reportedly repeated that Evan had been upbeat, with no mention of self-harm or risky plans. Deputies requested bank activity checks, then wrote that nothing changed after Friday afternoon. State records show his vehicle had normal contents, including a jacket and a second pair of shoes. That detail mattered later, because some locals claimed Evan planned an overnight camp, which would have required more gear. Investigators never confirmed those claims, and the archive notes treat them as rumor. A county file from 2009 mentions prior lost hikers in the same region, often due to simple navigation errors rather than drama. On the third day, searchers found a single shoe print in mud near a fallen log, deeper than earlier tracks. It matched the tread pattern of Evan's boots, at least according to an annotated photo in the case packet. The print faced uphill, which suggested he might have tried to climb out of a ravine. Nearby, they found a torn corner of a topographic map, wet and folded. Reportedly, Evan carried paper maps for work, so the find looked plausible. Investigators never confirmed the map corner belonged to him because the paper had no names or marks. Still, the location lined up with the drainage the helicopter avoided, which kept the same uncomfortable focus. One deputy wrote a short entry about a conversation with the pilot after the second refusal. In that note, the pilot reportedly said, "I've been briefed before, and I'm not going in there." The wording was vague, and state records do not include any formal briefing document. Some locals claimed the area was used for training flights and had strict no-fly rules, but investigators never confirmed an active restriction. County officials later told reporters there was no published temporary flight limitation at that time. Records conflict again because a volunteer ham operator said he heard a separate aircraft warn of hazards, yet no transcript exists. The case file treats the helicopter decision as a safety call, but it does not show how that conclusion was reached. Ground teams expanded the perimeter, checking logging spurs and creek crossings where an injured person might drift. They searched abandoned camps, culverts, and brushy slopes that could hide a body from casual view. Dispatch logs show several false alarms, including a tarp that looked like clothing from a distance. A K-9 team reportedly alerted near a stump hollow, then lost interest after handlers repositioned. Investigators wrote that wind and rain made scent work unreliable, and that is a common limitation. Still, the repeated pull toward the same drainage kept returning in the notes. By day 5, volunteer numbers dropped, and the search shifted from rescue to recovery language in county communications. A month later, a hunter contacted the sheriff's office with a story about hearing a whistle deep in the trees. He said it happened near the same drainage just after sunrise, with fog sitting low in the ravine. Investigators interviewed him, then filed the report as unconfirmed due to distance and poor visibility. Reportedly, the hunter also mentioned a helicopter that never flew overhead, which suggests the story traveled locally. County file annotations show the tip was revisited once, then closed without a new field push. Records conflict because another local later claimed the hunter changed details, but that claim is also unverified. No physical evidence came from that tip, yet it stayed in the rumor network around Mrballen and Grants Pass. In 2020, Evan's family requested public records, and portions of dispatch logs were released with redactions. Those logs confirm the refusals occurred, but they do not include the full audio that would explain tone and context. Archived notes show the incident commander asked for reasons, and the pilot kept answers short. Investigators later wrote that helicopter safety decisions can override mission need, especially near rotors and steep terrain. That is true in general, yet the file does not show a weather spike or mechanical issue that would single out one drainage. Some locals claimed the aircraft had a prior incident there, but investigators never confirmed any matching report. The uncertainty left space for stories to grow, while the concrete facts stayed thin and stubborn. A separate thread involved private timber operations because the drainage cut across active harvest units. State records show permission was requested to access certain roads, and the answer was granted with conditions. A supervisor reportedly told deputies that heavy equipment moved through earlier, which could erase tracks. Investigators noted the possibility, then wrote that they found no clear signs of recent grading at the key track site. Records conflict again because a volunteer photographer captured tire ruts in a nearby clearing, though the timestamp could not be verified. The helicopter refusal made some residents suspect a corporate restriction, yet there is no written rule in the county file. The simplest explanation remained turbulence, but the documentation does not fully support it. Maya was interviewed again in 2021, and her account gained small details that were hard to reconcile. She reportedly said Evan mentioned an old mine feature on the map, though she could not name it. Investigators never confirmed a mine entrance in that exact drainage, but archived notes mention adits in the broader region. She also said Evan's headlamp was new, bright enough to be seen from far away, which matched the earlier headlamp rumor. Records conflict on timing because her phone records show calls during the window she claimed to be driving home. The detective wrote that memory under stress can shift, and that explanation was placed in the file without further conclusion. Her role stayed uncertain, yet no evidence tied her to wrongdoing, and no charges were ever suggested in state records. The case became a reference point for local search volunteers, partly because of what did not happen from the air. In training meetings, some leaders reportedly cited it as a reminder that aircraft are not guaranteed support. Others treated it as a cautionary tale about assumptions in rugged pockets of Josephine County. Dispatch logs, state records, and archive notes show a pattern of effort, yet also a pattern of missing connective tissue. Investigators never confirmed whether the helicopter crew had prior intelligence, a safety memo, or a personal rule. The county file from 2009 is cited repeatedly as if older incidents were shaping modern decisions. That linkage may be practical, yet it also suggests institutional memory can become an unspoken map. In 2022, a hiker found a faded work glove near a creek bend and turned it in. It matched the size Evan wore, according to a family statement in the supplemental notes. The glove had no unique markings, and lab results reportedly found no DNA suitable for comparison. Investigators logged it, then wrote that the creek could carry items from upstream over years. Some locals claimed the find proved Evan reached the forbidden drainage, yet investigators never confirmed the glove's origin. Records conflict because the discovery site was described two different ways, one as upstream, one as downstream. The ambiguity kept the find from closing the case, leaving it as another loose object in a long file. By 2023, the official narrative had settled into careful language that avoided conclusions. The sheriff's office described Evan as missing, with circumstances unclear and no confirmed sightings after Friday. They referenced terrain, weather, and limited resources, and those factors are supported by dispatch logs. The helicopter refusals remained documented, but still unexplained in a way that satisfied everyone. Some locals claimed they knew the real reason, yet their stories never aligned, and investigators never confirmed any single account. The family continued periodic searches, guided by maps and old GPS points from volunteer teams. Each time, the same drainage drew attention, because it was the place the aircraft would not cross. In the end, the strangest feature of the case is not a mystery creature or a ghost story, but an administrative silence. A pilot refused a patch of forest, and the file never clearly states why that patch was different. Dispatch logs show the refusals, state records show the search effort, and archive notes show the questions asked. The county file from 2009 adds background, yet it does not provide a direct rule for 2019. Records conflict across witnesses, and investigators never confirmed the most dramatic claims circulating in Mrballen and Grants Pass. Evan Carver remains missing, and the most solid fact is a boundary in the air that nobody fully explained on paper. The Stone Heads of Hexham. The town of Hexham lies in Northumberland, situated in the northeast of England, a region saturated with the remnants of ancient history. It is a landscape defined by the rolling hills of the Tyne Valley and the enduring presence of Hadrian's Wall, a fortification that once marked the northernmost limit of the Roman Empire. The soil in this area has frequently yielded artifacts, coins, and fragments of pottery, debris left behind by centuries of occupation and conflict. In February of 1971, this historical context provided the backdrop for a series of events that began in a small, semi-detached house on Reed Avenue. The incident originated not with a grand archaeological excavation, but with the mundane domestic task of gardening. The residents of the home, the Robson family, were clearing overgrowth and preparing the soil for the coming spring. It was during this ordinary activity that two of the Robson children, Colin and Leslie, struck a hard object embedded in the earth. The boys, aged 11 and 6 at the time, were digging near the roots of a tree when their tools made contact with stone. Believing they had found something of interest, they cleared away the compacted dirt and pulled two spherical objects from the ground. These were not mere rocks, they were carved stone heads, roughly the size of tennis balls or oranges. The first head, slightly larger than the other, possessed crude but distinct features. It appeared to represent a male figure with a heavy brow, a nose that had been worn down by time or the elements, and a mouth that seemed merely a slit. The stone itself was a greenish-gray hue, flecked with quartz, suggesting a dense, heavy composition. The second head was smaller and arguably more disturbing to look at. It had wide, staring eyes and a pointed chin, leading the boys to refer to it initially as the witch, though later interpretations would vary. The craftsmanship was primitive, lacking the refinement of classical sculpture, yet the expressions carved into the rock were undeniably potent. Colin and Leslie Robson brought the objects inside the house, washing off the garden soil in the kitchen sink. The family was initially intrigued by the find. In a town like Hexham, discovering old stones was not entirely unheard of, though finding two distinct heads in a suburban garden was unusual. The heads were placed on a mantelpiece in the living room, treated as curious ornaments or perhaps lucky finds. There was no immediate sense of dread, nor any indication that the objects were anything other than inert geological curiosities. For the first few days, the house on Reed Avenue remained quiet. The routine of the family continued without interruption. However, this period of normalcy was short-lived. The atmosphere within the home began to shift subtly, a change that the family initially struggled to articulate. It started with a heaviness in the air, a sensation of pressure that seemed to localize in the room where the heads were kept. The first specific anomalies reported by the Robson family involved the movement of the heads themselves. According to the accounts given by the parents and the children, the stones would not remain in the positions they were placed. The family would arrange the heads facing out towards the room, only to find them turned inward or facing each other a short time later. At first, this was dismissed as the result of vibrations from passing traffic, or perhaps the children playing tricks, though the boys adamantly denied touching them. The weight of the stones made accidental movement unlikely. They were heavy enough that they required deliberate force to rotate. This phenomenon escalated from minor rotations to more significant displacements. On one occasion, the heads were reportedly found on the floor, seemingly having fallen from the mantelpiece despite being placed securely back from the edge. No impact sound had been heard. As the weeks progressed, the phenomena evolved from physical displacement to auditory disturbances. The residents began to report sounds that had no logical source within the house. These were not the typical creaks and settling noises of a suburban home. Witnesses described the sound of heavy footsteps walking across the floorboards in empty rooms. The footsteps were often slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. More unsettling were the reports of what sounded like glass shattering. Family members would rush to the kitchen or the living room, expecting to find a broken window or a dropped plate, only to find everything intact. The sound of breaking glass became a recurring motif in the haunting, a phantom noise that induced a state of constant high alert. The stress on the family began to mount. Sleep was disrupted, and the children became reluctant to be left alone in the room with the stone heads. The activity was not confined to the interior of the Robson home. The next phase of the incident involved the immediate neighbors, specifically the family living next door. The properties on Reed Avenue were separated by thin walls and shared fences, meaning that disturbances in one home could easily be perceived in the other. However, the neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Dodd, reported experiences that went beyond hearing noise through the partition. Her account introduced a visual element to the phenomena that significantly darkened the tone of the events. Mrs. Dodd had initially been skeptical of the stories coming from the Robson house, but her perspective changed when she experienced a direct encounter. She reported waking in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving in the room with her. According to Mrs. Dodd's testimony, which was later recorded in local press reports, she felt a presence by her bed. When she looked, she saw a figure standing in the darkness. She described the entity as being half man and half beast, utilizing a description that closely mirrored the archetype of a werewolf or a satyr. The figure was dark, covered in what appeared to be fur or hair, and it stood on two legs. She claimed that the creature touched her leg, a sensation she described as soft and patting, before it moved away. Mrs. Dodd was terrified, screaming for her husband, but by the time the light was turned on, the figure was gone. This report of a theriomorphic figure, an entity combining human and animal characteristics, marked a turning point in the local perception of the Hexam heads. It was no longer a matter of moving stones, it was now a matter of a predatory presence. The Robson family, now deeply disturbed by the combination of poltergeist-like activity and the terrifying report from their neighbor, sought to distance themselves from the artifacts. The novelty of the discovery had entirely worn off, replaced by a genuine fear that the stones were a conduit for something malevolent. The story had begun to circulate in the local area, attracting the attention of those interested in folklore and archaeology. It was at this juncture that the heads came to the attention of Dr. Ann Ross. Dr. Ross was a highly respected academic, an archaeologist, and an expert on Celtic history and religion. She held a particular interest in the significance of the severed head in Iron Age culture, a motif that appears frequently in Celtic art and mythology. Hearing of the discovery in Hexham, she approached the family and offered to take the stones for examination. The Robsons were relieved to hand the objects over. The transfer of the heads moved the epicenter of the phenomena from the semi-detached house in Hexham to Dr. Ross's home in Southampton. Dr. Ross approached the artifacts with a scientific mindset. She was not a ghost hunter. She was a scholar looking to determine the age, origin, and cultural context of the carvings. She hypothesized that the heads were potentially Celtic in origin, dating back perhaps 2,000 years, possibly associated with a shrine or a ritual site near the Roman wall. The rough carving style and the stone composition were consistent with local workmanship of the Roman British period. She brought the heads into her study, placing them on a desk to conduct a detailed analysis of their dimensions and tool marks. Almost immediately upon the arrival of the heads in Southampton, Dr. Ross began to experience phenomena identical to, and in some cases more intense than, what the Robson family had reported. The professional detachment she maintained was tested by the environment that developed in her home. She reported a sudden and inexplicable drop in temperature in the room where the heads were kept. This was not a draft, but a localized cold spot that seemed to emanate from the artifacts themselves. The sensation was described as a damp, penetrating chill that central heating could not dispel. Along with the cold came the sensation of being watched. Dr. Ross, who was accustomed to working late hours in her study with various ancient artifacts, found herself unable to concentrate. The feeling of a presence was overwhelming, forcing her to leave the room on multiple occasions. The auditory phenomena also resumed. Dr. Ross and her family heard the sound of heavy breathing in empty corridors. Doors that had been latched were found standing open. The phantom footsteps returned, pacing the landing and the stairs. The escalation in Dr. Ross's home culminated in a visual sighting that mirrored the experience of Mrs. Dodd in Hexham. One morning, Dr. Ross was walking up the stairs of her home when she looked towards the landing. She saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs, blocking her path. In her accounts, she described the figure as having the body of a man, but the upper portion was wolf-like. It was dark, shadowy, and exuded an aura of absolute malice. The entity did not attack, but simply stood its ground, projecting a sense of territorial dominance. Dr. Ross, struck by fear, retreated down the stairs. When she returned with others, the figure had vanished. Crucially, Dr. Ross was not the only witness in the Southampton house. Her daughter, Berenice, who was unaware of the specific details of the Hexham reports, also encountered the entity. Berenice reported coming home one afternoon and seeing a large, dark creature leaping over the banister of the stairs. She described it as resembling a wolf or a large dog, but moving with unnatural agility and silence. The creature ran towards the back of the house and disappeared. This independent corroboration from her daughter, who had not been primed with the werewolf imagery by the Hexham neighbor, deeply shook Dr. Ross. It suggested that the phenomena were external and objective rather than a product of suggestion or hysteria. The consistency of the wolf-like description between the two locations, Hexham and Southampton, was difficult to dismiss. Dr. Ross felt a responsibility to understand what she was dealing with. She contacted other colleagues in the field of archaeology and the paranormal. The heads were subjected to geological analysis to confirm their source. The stone was identified as a type of sandstone consistent with the geology of the Tyne Valley, supporting the idea that they were carved locally. However, the dating of stone carvings is notoriously difficult. Unlike organic material, stone cannot be carbon dated. The age must be inferred from the style, the wear, and the context of the find. Dr. Ross remained convinced that the heads were ancient, likely from the Roman-British period, and that they perhaps functioned as apotropaic items, objects intended to ward off evil, or, conversely, objects used in cursing rituals. The Celtic cult of the head believed that the soul resided in the head, and severed heads were often venerated or used as offerings to water sources. As the reputation of the Hexham heads grew, so did the controversy surrounding them. The story attracted the attention of the media and other researchers. In the midst of the paranormal storm, a counter-narrative emerged that threatened to dismantle the ancient origin theory. A man named Desmond Craigie, who had lived in the Robsons' house on Reed Avenue previously, came forward. Craigie was a former resident of the area and worked in the cement industry. He claimed that the heads were not ancient Celtic artifacts at all. He stated that he had made the heads himself in 1956, roughly 15 years before the Robson boys found them. According to Craigie, he had created them as toys for his daughter using a mixture of cement, sand, and water. He claimed he had lost them in the garden and forgotten about them. This revelation introduced a sharp conflict in the narrative. On one side stood Dr. Ross, a leading expert who argued that the stone composition and the style were authentically ancient. She noted that the heads contained quartz flecks and did not look like simple concrete. On the other side was Craigie, offering a mundane explanation that stripped the objects of their historical mystique. If Craigie was telling the truth, the heads were barely 2 decades old. However, this raised an even more unsettling question. If the heads were merely modern concrete dolls, why did they trigger such intense and consistent paranormal phenomena? The discrepancy between the object's alleged mundane origin and the severity of the haunting created a paradox. Skeptics used Craigie's claim to dismiss the entire affair, while proponents of the paranormal argued that the age of the object might be irrelevant to its ability to act as a focus for energy. To settle the dispute, the heads were subjected to further chemical analysis. The results were ambiguous. Some reports suggested the material was indeed an artificial composite supporting Craigie's claim. Others pointed to the presence of natural quartz that would be unusual in a simple concrete mix made by a hobbyist. Dr. Ross maintained her skepticism of Craigie's claim, noting that the artistic style, particularly the slit mouth and the heavy brow, was characteristic of a specific Iron Age aesthetic that a modern cement worker would be unlikely to replicate by accident. Furthermore, even if the heads were modern, the phenomena surrounding them, the shattering sounds, the moving objects, the wolf creature remained unexplained. The narrative had split into 2 strands, the archaeological puzzle and the active haunting. The pressure of the haunting eventually became too much for Dr. Ross. The atmosphere in her home had become oppressive, and the safety of her family was her primary concern. The pervasive sense of evil, the cold spots, and the visual manifestations of the wolf creature necessitated the removal of the objects. The heads were passed out of her possession. Accounts vary regarding the exact chain of custody that followed. Some reports state they were given to other researchers, others suggest they were placed in a museum storage facility. For a time, they were held by the writer and researcher Dr. Don Robbins, who also reported strange energy anomalies around the objects. In his possession, the heads continued to be associated with electrical disturbances and a general sense of unease, though perhaps less violent than the events at the Ross residence. Following their departure from the Ross household, the trail of the Hexam heads becomes murky. They did not remain in a single public display. Instead, they seemed to drift into the obscurity of private collections. There are rumors that they were buried or that they were lost during a transfer between researchers. The current whereabouts of the original stones are unknown. This disappearance has only added to the legend. Without the physical objects to examine, modern science cannot use advanced techniques to definitively prove or disprove the concrete versus stone debate. The heads exist now only in photographs and in the written testimonies of those who endured their presence. The photographs show 2 seemingly innocuous gray spheres, their carved faces staring blankly, revealing nothing of the chaos they allegedly unleashed. The legacy of the Hexam heads rests on the consistency of the witness accounts. In many paranormal cases, the phenomena are vague or subjective. In this instance, unrelated witnesses, a suburban family in Northumberland, a neighbor, a distinguished academic in Southampton, and her daughter all reported the same specific entity, a werewolf-like figure. This specific detail is incongruous with standard ghost stories, which usually involve human apparitions. The werewolf motif is rare and specific, that it appeared independently to the neighbor Mrs. Dodd and to Dr. Ann Ross suggests a link that cannot be easily explained by coincidence. If it was mass hysteria, the transmission vector was unusually efficient, leaping geographically and infecting a skeptical academic who had no prior knowledge of the neighbor's vision. The environment of Hexham itself returned to normal after the heads were removed. The Robson family reported no further disturbances once the stones were gone. The house on Reed Avenue settled back into the quiet rhythm of suburban life. The garden where the boys had dug remained just a garden. Whatever energy or entity had been attached to the stones apparently traveled with them, leaving the location of the discovery clean. This supports the theory of an attachment haunting, where the phenomenon is anchored to an object rather than a place. The soil of Hexham, however, remains rich with history. The Roman wall still stands, and the potential for other artifacts to be unearthed remains. The incident serves as a cautionary tale within the community about the consequences of disturbing what lies beneath the earth. Retrospective analysis of the case often focuses on the Craigie candidate theory that the heads were modern fakes. If one accepts this, the story becomes a fascinating study in psychometry or the stone tape theory applied to modern objects. Can a modern object accumulate negative energy? Or was the entity entirely separate from the heads, merely using their discovery as a trigger to manifest? Some researchers have suggested that the land itself was cursed, and the heads were merely keys that unlocked a pre-existing dormant energy. The werewolf figure draws parallels to ancient guardian spirits or local folklore regarding the wolver or similar beasts in British mythology, hinting that the entity might have been much older than the stones themselves, regardless of whether the stones were Roman or made in 1956. The intersection of the mundane and the monstrous is what defines the Hexham Heads incident. It began with weeding and ended with a wolfman on a staircase. There were no crimes committed, no police investigations into murders, only an invasion of domestic safety by something irrational. The witnesses were credible, ordinary people. The Robsons were not seeking fame, they were simply a family who wanted the strange noises to stop. Dr. Ross was not a sensationalist. She was a scholar who found her scientific worldview challenged by the impossible. Their testimonies remain on record, a documentation of a few months in 1971 and 1972, when the barrier between the known world and the unexplained became terrifyingly thin. Even today, in the study of paranormal history, the Hexham Heads occupy a unique niche. They are physical evidence that vanished, a verified discovery that led to unverifiable horrors. The description of the boy and the witch remains etched in the minds of those who study the case. The boy, with his passive, worn face, and the witch, with her wild eyes, serve as the icons of the event. Whether they were ancient idols demanding reverence or cursed toys created by a cement worker, the effect they had on the lives of those who held them was undeniable. The fear was real. The footsteps were audible. The figure on the stairs was visible. And then, silence. The narrative of the Hexham Heads concludes not with a definitive answer, but with an open-ended silence. The objects are gone, the witnesses have aged or passed away. The houses in Hexham and Southampton stand as they always have, but the records remain preserved in the archives of the paranormal, detailing a sequence of events that defies easy categorization. It is a story of how the past, or perhaps something mimicking the past, can violently intrude upon the present. It stands as a reminder that some things found in the earth are perhaps best left buried, and that the line between a curiosity and a curse is often only visible once it has been crossed. The Byron Street Disturbance. The town of Runcorn, situated on the southern bank of the River Mersey in the county of Cheshire, was a place defined by industry and routine in the early 1950s. It was a landscape of red brick terraced housing, chemical works, and the lingering austerity of the post-war era. The community was tight-knit, grounded in the practical realities of labor and domestic life, with little patience for flights of fancy or superstitious hysteria. In August of 1952, this pragmatic atmosphere was ruptured by a series of events centered on a small, unremarkable row house at 1 Byron Street. The incidents that occurred within the walls of this residence were witnessed not only by the inhabitants, but by neighbors, journalists, and, most significantly, serving officers of the Cheshire Constabulary. The subsequent investigation produced a set of police records that remain among the most puzzling in the history of British domestic disturbances, detailing physical phenomena that defied the laws of mechanics and ballistics. The case was never criminally prosecuted, as no human perpetrator could be identified, and the events eventually ceased as abruptly as they had begun, leaving a residue of unanswered questions that lingers in the archival record. The residence at 1 Byron Street was occupied by the Jones family. The household consisted of 68-year-old John Jones, a man recently widowed, his son Samuel, Samuel's wife Eileen, and their 2 young grandsons. The emotional climate of the home had been somber in the weeks leading up to the disturbances. John Jones was grieving the loss of his wife, who had passed away earlier that year. In the cramped conditions typical of the era, the family members lived in close quarters, with tensions and grief sharing the same limited air. The patriarch, John, occupied a bedroom on the upper floor, a room that would soon become the focal point of the anomaly. The initial signs of unrest were subtle, manifesting as auditory irritants rather than visual terrors. In mid-August, the family began to report sounds that had no logical source. There were scratchings within the wall cavities, the sound of heavy thuds on the floorboards above when the upstairs rooms were known to be empty, and the distinct, unnerving noise of drawers being opened and closed violently. At first, the Jones family attributed these noises to the settling of the house or perhaps the intrusion of vermin, a common enough occurrence in the terraced streets near the river. Samuel Jones, a practical man, inspected the floorboards and the attic spaces but found no evidence of structural shifting or animal infestation. The plumbing was checked, the windows were secured, and the neighbors were consulted to see if the sounds were traveling through the party walls. No explanation was forthcoming. The noises escalated rapidly from ambiguous creaks to deliberate, rhythmic banging that seemed to respond to the presence of the family members. It was not until the events of the weekend of August 17th that the phenomena transitioned from auditory to kinetic, precipitating a crisis that would force the family to seek external assistance. The escalation began in the bedroom of John Jones. The room was sparsely furnished, dominated by a heavy chest of drawers and a bed. On the evening in question, the family was downstairs when a tremendous crash shook the ceiling plaster. Rushing upstairs, they found the bedroom in disarray. The heavy furniture, items that required significant effort for a grown man to lift, had been displaced. This was the beginning of a siege that would last for weeks. Over the next few days, the activity intensified. Objects began to move with a visible trajectory that witnesses described as unnatural. It was not merely that things fell, it was that they flew. Books, clock faces, and small ornaments were reported to lift from surfaces and travel across the room, often navigating around obstacles before striking the walls or floor. Terrified and exhausted, the family turned to the only authority available to them, the local police. The involvement of the Cheshire Constabulary is what distinguishes the Runcorn case from countless other anecdotal hauntings. Police officers are trained observers, required to record facts, times, and physical evidence in official notebooks. They are professionally predisposed to skepticism and are tasked with finding human perpetrators for disruptive behavior. When Constable T.A. Edwards arrived at the property, he did so with the expectation of finding a practical joke, a domestic dispute, or a structural fault. What he encountered instead would become part of the official police log. Edwards, along with other officers who would visit the property over the ensuing weeks, found himself acting not as an investigator of crime, but as a witness to the impossible. During one of the initial vigils held by the police, the officers positioned themselves in the bedroom, ensuring that no family members were present in the room and that the space was sealed from external interference. The room was inspected for wires, hidden mechanisms, or drafts. It was a still, humid night. According to the reports filed later, the officers witnessed the heavy chest of drawers, which was devoid of wheels or casters, lift one side from the floor and rotate. There was no one near the object. The movement was accompanied by a vibration that could be felt through the floorboards. Constable Edwards checked the perimeter again, looking for any sign of a hoax, but the room was secure. The movement of the furniture was not the result of a sudden jolt or explosion. It was described as a deliberate, controlled force application. As the news of the disturbances spread, the environment around Byron Street transformed. The private terror of the Jones family became a public spectacle. Crowds began to gather at the ends of the street, drawn by rumors of the Runcorn poltergeist. The term poltergeist, meaning noisy ghost, was used liberally by the press, although the police and the family avoided such labels, preferring to describe the events simply as disturbances. The presence of the crowd added a layer of chaos to the investigation. Officers now had to manage traffic and disperse onlookers while simultaneously trying to document the inexplicable events occurring inside Number 1. The psychological strain on the family was immense. Eileen Jones, in particular, was reported to be near the point of collapse, terrified for the safety of her children and unable to sleep due to the constant activity in the house. The physical phenomena continued to evolve in complexity. It was not just heavy furniture that moved, smaller objects displayed a disturbing dexterity. A family Bible was reported to have been thrown across the room by an unseen hand. A table lamp was observed to rock violently before toppling over, despite the absence of any vibration in the floor. One of the most chilling reports involved a shapeless, dark shadow seen by Samuel Jones on the landing, a visual manifestation that marked a departure from the purely kinetic activity. The police, struggling to maintain order and rationality, brought in reinforcements. A thorough search of the house was conducted, including the lifting of floorboards and the inspection of the roof space. The search revealed nothing out of the ordinary. No hidden accomplices, no trickery, no geological faults. The house was simply a brick box, behaving in a way that physics dictated it should not. The local newspaper, the Times Runcorn Weekly News *, began to chronicle the events, treating the story with a degree of seriousness that reflected the testimony of the police officers. The reports from late August detail an incident where a clock, securely fastened to the wall, was ripped from its mountings and thrown to the floor while officers were present in the house. The force required to detach the clock was significant, yet no person was within reach of the object. The trajectory of the clock was noted to be flat and forceful, inconsistent with a simple fall due to gravity or a loose screw. It was as if the object had been swatted by an invisible limb. The police logs from this period reflect a growing sense of frustration and unease among the officers. They were trained to arrest criminals, not to wrestle with the unseen. In an attempt to find a solution, the family and their neighbors tried various remedies. Prayers were said and the house was blessed, but the activity seemed indifferent to religious intervention. If anything, the introduction of religious iconography seemed to provoke a more violent response. Objects associated with faith were often the first to be targeted. The atmosphere in the house was described as heavy, with a palpable drop in temperature often preceding the physical outbursts. This cold spot phenomenon, while a cliché in fiction, was reported as a genuine sensory experience by the officers, who noted a sudden chill in the air even on warm summer nights. The cold was localized, often confined to the bedroom or the landing, and would dissipate as soon as the activity ceased. The turning point in the public perception of the case came when the phenomenon began to interact with the police directly. During a night watch, an officer reported being struck by a flying object. The object, a small tin, hit the officer with force but did not cause serious injury. It was the intent behind the action that was disturbing. The entity, or force, appeared to be aware of the observers and capable of targeting them. This aggression escalated the situation from a curiosity to a threat. The police hierarchy was in a difficult position. They could not arrest a ghost, nor could they abandon a family clearly in distress. They continued their vigils, recording the events with a meticulousness that now serves as the primary validation of the case. Their records state clearly that objects moved of their own accord, that noises originated from empty spaces, and that the family was not responsible for the chaos. One particular night stands out in the accumulated testimonies. It was a weekend in late August when the activity reached a fever pitch. The heavy dressing table in John Jones's room began to dance. Witnesses described the piece of furniture lifting and dropping repeatedly, creating a rhythmic pounding that could be heard in the street outside. The police, standing in the doorway, shone their torches on the object. They saw it rise several inches into the air, hover momentarily, and then crash down. The drawers rattled violently, and the mirror attached to the unit shook but did not break. The officers checked for wires or strings, passing their hands around the object while it was in motion. There was nothing. The sheer energy required to lift such a weight repeatedly was immense, yet the source of that energy remained undetectable. The investigation attracted the attention of casual researchers and spiritualists, though the serious parapsychological organizations of the time were slower to mobilize than they would be in later decades. The phenomena at Byron Street were largely managed by the local community and the constabulary. This isolation meant that the case was not contaminated by the presence of media-savvy ghost hunters or television crews. The documentation remains raw and immediate, filtering through the lens of police procedure rather than entertainment. The officers' accounts are devoid of sensationalism. They use the language of the beat cop, factual, descriptive, and utterly baffled. They report unauthorized movements and displaced items rather than demons or spirits, which lends the accounts a terrifying credibility. As September approached, the nature of the disturbances began to change. The violence lessened, replaced by a sullen, brooding atmosphere. The banging continued, but with less frequency. The family, exhausted and fraying at the edges, began to discuss leaving the house. The neighbors, too, were weary of the constant crowds and the disruption to their quiet street. The spectacle had run its course, and the adrenaline of the initial weeks was replaced by a grim endurance. It was during this waning phase that the final significant event occurred. A police officer, sitting alone in the kitchen, reported hearing a voice. It was not a distinct sentence, but a guttural, unintelligible vocalization that seemed to emanate from the corner of the room. He described it as sounding like a breathless rasp. No one else was in the kitchen. This auditory manifestation was the only time a voice was reported, adding a layer of intelligence or sentience to what had previously been a display of brute force. The cessation of the Runcorn disturbances was as mysterious as their onset. By the middle of September 1952, the activity simply stopped. There was no exorcism, no dramatic climax, and no discovery of a hoax. The house fell silent, the heavy furniture remained stationary, the flying objects stayed on their shelves. The police withdrew their vigils, filing their final reports with no conclusion as to the cause of the disorder. The crowds dispersed, and Byron Street returned to its mundane existence. The Jones family remained in the house for a time, wary and scarred by the experience, but the phenomena did not return. The abrupt ending is common in poltergeist cases, often leaving victims and researchers without closure or explanation. The aftermath of the Byron Street case left a legacy of confusion in the local area. The police officers involved rarely spoke of the events in later years, perhaps fearing ridicule or professional repercussions. However, the written records survived. In the archives of the Cheshire Constabulary and the local press, the details of the Runcorn poltergeist are preserved. They tell of a time when the rational world of 1950s England collided with the irrational, and the authorities of the state were forced to document the impossible. The case was never solved. No trickery was ever exposed. The family was never found to be complicit. The events happened, were observed, were recorded, and then ceased. What makes the Runcorn case particularly unsettling is the mundane nature of the setting. This was not a Gothic mansion or a lonely farmhouse. It was a terraced house in a crowded industrial town. The walls were thin, the neighbors were close, the privacy required for an elaborate hoax was simply not available. The presence of the police, acting as independent verifiers, removes the possibility of mass hysteria or family fabrication. These were men who dealt with drunkards, thieves, and domestic abusers. They were not prone to flights of fancy. When they wrote that a clock flew across a room, they did so because they saw a clock fly across a room. The cognitive dissonance experienced by these officers is palpable in their reports, a struggle to reconcile their training with their sensory experience. The theories surrounding the case at the time focused heavily on the energy of the household. Researchers of the era often looked to the presence of adolescence or emotional trauma as a catalyst for poltergeist activity. The grief of John Jones, mourning his late wife, was seen by some as a potential trigger, a projection of psychic pain that manifested as kinetic energy. Others looked to the grandsons, suggesting that the repressed energy of youth in a strict, crowded household was erupting in physical outbursts. However, these were merely hypotheses. No mechanism has ever been established that explains how grief or puberty can cause a 400-pound dressing table to levitate. The gap between the psychological theory and the physical reality remains unbridged. Retrospective analysis of the Byron Street disturbance often highlights the specificity of the phenomena. The objects that moved were domestic drawers, clocks, Bibles, lamps. It was an assault on the domestic sphere, a disruption of the order that the Jones family tried to maintain. The violence was directed at the home itself, turning the sanctuary of the bedroom into a zone of danger. The poltergeist did not just make noise, it dismantled the room, it stripped the bed, overturned the furniture, and threw the symbols of stability, the clock and the Bible, into the air. It was a localized rebellion against the physical order of the house. In the years that followed, the story of one Byron Street faded from the national consciousness, overshadowed by more sensational cases like Enfield or the Borley Rectory. However, among researchers of anomalous phenomena, Runcorn holds a special place due to the quality of the testimony. It serves as a reminder that high strangeness is not confined to folklore or history. It can occur in the presence of the law under the glare of a torch in a council house in Cheshire. The silence that followed the events of 1952 has never been fully broken. The house still stands, the street remains, but the force that briefly occupied number 1 has gone. The reconstruction of the events relies heavily on the timeline established by the police visits. On August 17th, the first report was filed. On August 19th, the dresser moved. On August 22nd, the media arrived. By September 10th, the activity was waning. This condensed timeline of less than a month contained a lifetime of trauma for the residents. The intensity of the experience was such that the family's recollection of those weeks became blurred, a montage of fear and sleeplessness. It was the police logs that provided the structure, anchoring the nightmare in dates and times. Without the intervention of the constabulary, the story might have been dismissed as neighborhood gossip. With it, it becomes a matter of record. One detail that is often overlooked in summaries of the case is the behavior of the family dog. Reports mention that the animal would refuse to enter the bedroom of John Jones, growling at the empty air and cowering in the corner of the landing. Animals are frequently cited as early warning systems in such cases, and the reaction of the Joneses' dog suggests that the phenomena had a sensory component that was perceptible to non-humans before it became visible to the people. The dog's terror added to the atmosphere of dread, reinforcing the feeling that an intruder was present in the house, even if that intruder had no body. The final aspect of the Runcorn case that ensures its endurance is the lack of a moral or narrative conclusion. In fiction, the ghost is laid to rest, the crime is solved, or the family flees. In Runcorn, none of this happened. The family stayed. The ghost just stopped. There was no message delivered, no bones found in the cellar, no curse lifted. The randomness of the event is its most disturbing feature. It implies that the laws of physics can be suspended arbitrarily, without cause or warning, and then reinstated just as easily. It suggests a universe that is more permeable and less stable than we are comfortable admitting. The residents of Byron Street went back to work, the police went back to catching thieves, and the file was closed, but the anomaly remained a fact. To this day, the Byron Street disturbance is cited in parapsychological literature as a perfect poltergeist case. Short duration, high intensity, credible witnesses, and zero explanation. It stands as a testament to the limitations of our understanding of the physical world. The officers who stood in that bedroom and watched a dresser float did not believe in ghosts, but they had to believe their eyes. They wrote it down, signed their names, and filed the report. And in that act of bureaucratic witnessing, they preserved a moment where reality blinked. The story of the Runcorn poltergeist is not a story of a haunted house. It is a story of a haunted reality, a brief window into a world where the impossible becomes the inevitable. Every victim was experienced. In western Montana, near Missoula County, a pattern emerged that didn't fit the usual stories locals told visitors. In late autumn of 2009, a dispatcher logged a call about a missing backcountry guide near the Lolo National Forest. The caller said the man was 36, employed seasonally, and scouting a winter route for paying clients. County file from 2009 described him as careful, radio-trained, and obsessed with redundancy. Search leaders reportedly expected a short operation because the weather was stable and visibility stayed clear. By midnight, dispatch logs recorded only one clue, a set of boot prints that ended at Bear Rock. State records later listed the missing guide as Owen Hartley, though archived notes used a different last name on one page. Investigators never confirmed whether that discrepancy was a clerical error or a second identity used for contract work. He carried a satellite messenger, yet the device never sent a distress burst, according to the manufacturer report. Some locals claimed they heard a single rifle crack that afternoon, but no hunter in the area admitted firing. When the first team reached his planned ridge, they found no camp, no food, and no sign of a fall. 2 weeks later, a second call came in from a trailhead farther south, near the Bitterroot Valley, again in Missoula County jurisdiction. A woman named Maris Keller, 41, worked as a physical therapist and ran ultramarathons on weekends. She was reportedly training for a winter race and used that route because it was popular and mapped. Her husband provided a timeline with credit card receipts, but records conflict on the exact hour she arrived. Dispatch logs show officers were told she carried a headlamp, a whistle, and a laminated map. Searchers treated Keller as a standard overdue hiker case and started with the most traveled junctions and creek crossings. A canine unit reportedly hit hard along a narrow spur, then broke trail into timber and circled back repeatedly. Archive notes describe the dog handler as frustrated because the scent line seemed to restart after long gaps. Investigators never confirmed whether the restarting pattern came from wind shifts or contamination by volunteers. Late that night, a deputy recorded that Keller's car was locked and her keys were not inside. 3 days into the Keller search, a helicopter crew reported a bright object near a shale slide roughly 2 miles from the trail. Ground teams reached it and documented a single running shoe with fresh scuffing on the sole. State records said the shoe matched Keller's size, but the brand differed between 2 separate inventory sheets. Some locals claimed the shoe looked placed rather than lost, though no photograph proved that either way. Investigators never confirmed any footprints nearby because early snow covered the slope before technicians arrived. The county file from 2009 added a short line, "No other clothing located." In early spring of 2010, Missoula County received a new report, this time involving a fishing guide from nearby Mrballen County. His name in dispatch logs was Daniel Rook, 39, and he guided float trips and ran a small repair shop. He was in the area to evaluate runoff conditions and photograph river access points for his clients. Reportedly, he left a voicemail saying he was hiking a short loop and would be back before dark. That evening, his truck was found at a pullout with the driver window partly down despite cold wind. Rook's friends described him as experienced and risk-aware, which made the window detail stand out in archived notes. Searchers followed his planned loop and found fresh boot marks entering a side drainage that wasn't on his itinerary. Investigators never confirmed whether he changed plans or was following something he noticed along the creek. A state record later listed his phone as powered on until midnight, yet no tower pings were stored. Some locals claimed coverage there is unreliable, but the record doesn't explain the powered status clearly. The next morning, dispatch logs mention a short burst of static on a handheld radio borrowed from his shop. By midsummer of 2010, the cases were being compared informally by deputies who rotated between mountain calls. Archived notes show one sergeant writing that each missing person had training, fitness, and multiple safety tools. He reportedly told a colleague that most inexperienced hikers make obvious mistakes, but these people left almost nothing. Investigators never confirmed a common location beyond the broad forest boundary and county lines. Some locals claimed an outlaw grow operation might explain silence, though no raid report supported that claim. Still, the rumor persisted because it fit a familiar narrative about remote valleys. In 2011, a fourth disappearance brought more attention, partly because it involved an off-duty paramedic from the city of Missoula. Her name was Tessa Wynn, 29, and she worked night shifts and hiked alone on recovery days. She reportedly chose a route near Seeley Lake to avoid crowds, using a trail she had logged in a paper notebook. Dispatch logs show her partner called after a missed check-in, saying she always texted at each summit. State records list her phone as found later, though investigators never confirmed the exact finder identity. The device had water damage and no readable recent messages, according to archived notes. Nguyen's pack was recovered downstream in a shallow bend, placed against a logjam and still partly zipped. Search teams cataloged a first aid pouch, an emergency blanket, and a half-full bottle, then noted missing footwear. Some locals claimed they saw a lone figure on the opposite bank at dusk, but the witness changed details in later interviews. Investigators never confirmed whether Nguyen attempted a crossing because the river level fluctuated and erased evidence. Dispatch logs include a line about a faint call for help reported by a camper, yet audio verification was impossible. The county file from 2009 was referenced again in the margins, linking the earlier missing guide. Around this time, state records show a meeting where county officials discussed whether to share details publicly. Archived notes indicate concern about encouraging copycat rescues or driving tourism fear during peak season. They reportedly settled on brief press releases that stressed weather hazards and voluntary risk. Investigators never confirmed the internal debate because minutes were incomplete and several pages were redacted. Some locals claimed that secrecy meant something criminal, but the paperwork reads more like caution than conspiracy. Still, the limited information created space for confident speculation and louder stories. In late 2012, a fifth case surfaced near Frenchtown involving a man who trained military dogs after leaving service. His name was Keith Salazar, 44, employed by a private contractor, and he tested scent routines in varied terrain. He reportedly visited public land to evaluate a new dog's endurance and obedience under distraction. Dispatch logs show he checked in with a friend at 2 p.m., then stopped answering by 4 p.m. His vehicle was found with a kennel crate inside and a single leash on the seat. State records list the dog as recovered later, but records conflict on the distance traveled. The dog returned to a rural road, muddy and exhausted, and a passing driver called it in. Searchers reportedly followed tracks that led into thick brush, then scattered across stony ground near a cutbank. Investigators never confirmed whether Salazar was alone when he entered the brush because the track count was unclear. Some locals claimed they saw another truck on that road earlier, but no plate number was recorded. Archived notes describe Salazar as a person who planned exits and carried spare batteries for everything. Yet only one item was found, a nylon glove snagged on a branch, photographed and bagged. Dispatch logs show the search was scaled back after day 6 due to staffing limits. A county file from 2013 tried to summarize the growing list of missing persons for administrative review. It described each victim as experienced, physically strong, and familiar with backcountry routines. The file also noted that initial clues tended to appear isolated, like single items without an obvious context. Investigators never confirmed whether that pattern was meaningful or a bias created by comparing unrelated incidents. Some locals claimed the items were planted as misdirection, but evidence for that idea never surfaced. Still, the phrase "left without a trace" appeared repeatedly in archived notes and media summaries. In 2014, a volunteer search coordinator from neighboring Granite County went missing after a training exercise. Her name was Aileen Moss, 38, and she managed logistics for rescues while teaching wilderness navigation. She reportedly stayed behind after the exercise to retrieve cached markers and verify map coordinates. Dispatch logs show her radio transmitted twice, then cut out mid-sentence with no follow-up signal. State records said batteries tested normal, but investigators never confirmed whether the unit was submerged or damaged. Some locals claimed they heard shouting near a ravine, but the timeline didn't match her last radio call. A helicopter crew later reported seeing disturbed talus, though ground teams found nothing conclusive. Moss's case unsettled responders because she knew the protocols that usually prevent a disappearance from becoming a mystery. Archived notes show team leaders writing about how she would have left a trail sign or used whistle blasts. Investigators never confirmed whether the training environment created false confidence and reduced her caution. Some locals claimed her disappearance proved the area was uniquely dangerous, but the terrain there is common across the region. County records emphasize that sudden storms can turn trails into sliding surfaces, even in seasons that seem safe. Yet dispatch logs from that afternoon describe mild conditions and stable skies. The inconsistency became a key tension in later retellings. By 2015, reporters began comparing these incidents in long-form pieces, though many details remained vague. State records indicate officials answered with general statements about risk, preparedness, and the limits of wilderness resources. Investigators never confirmed a single cause because each case lacked the decisive evidence needed for closure. Some locals claimed authorities were hiding foul play, but archived notes show repeated checks for criminal indicators. The more common conclusion was simply absence of information, which is not satisfying and rarely stays quiet. This uncertainty fed a cycle where every new missing report was instantly tied to the earlier ones. In early 2016, another disappearance occurred near the Clark Fork River corridor involving a rock climbing instructor. His name was Ian Braddock, 32, and he worked for an outdoor school teaching rope safety and anchors. He reportedly went out to inspect a cliff line after a freeze-thaw cycle, planning to update the school's hazard notes. Dispatch logs show a student called after Braddock missed an evening briefing, which was unusual for him. A sheriff's deputy found his rope bag and helmet near the base of a wall, but no blood was noted. State records list the gear as undamaged, though photographs were limited. Investigators never confirmed whether Braddock reached the wall or turned around before climbing. A climbing team searched the wall and adjacent gullies, focusing on fall lines and likely belay stations. They reportedly found chalk marks on one rock, but the marks couldn't be tied to Braddock with certainty. Some locals claimed the chalk looked fresh, while others said that wall sees traffic all summer. Investigators never confirmed the time of the chalk deposit because there was no rain signature to bracket it. Dispatch logs mention a single shout heard by a nearby fisherman, but the fisherman gave no direction estimate. After a week, the search concluded with no trace, and the case joined the stack of unresolved files. The phrase "every victim was experienced" began appearing in informal briefings, then in public comments. Archived notes show officials trying to avoid that wording because it implied that skill should guarantee safety. State records repeatedly stress that experience reduces risk but doesn't erase it, especially around water, rock, and sudden exposure. Investigators never confirmed whether the experience label created complacency in the victims or in the response assumptions. Some locals claimed the label pointed to a predator who targeted competence, but that idea lacked evidence and wasn't treated as a formal theory. The official stance remained that the wilderness can strip away information faster than people expect. A review memo in 2017 attempted to identify operational improvements rather than solve the past. It recommended faster evidence preservation, tighter volunteer control, and more consistent documentation of last known points. Dispatch logs show that earlier cases often had wide delays between last contact and formal reporting. State records also noted that cell and satellite devices can fail for mundane reasons, including battery issues and terrain shielding. Investigators never confirmed whether any device failures were due to hardware defects or simple misuse. Some locals claimed new technology would have solved everything, but the memo treated technology as one tool among many. The memo also urged cross-county coordination to reduce record conflicts. In 2018, a final case in this cluster drew a brief surge of attention, then faded like the others. A man named Curtis Dyer, 47, worked as a forest contractor and spent months clearing hazard trees. He reportedly went out near the Blackfoot River drainage to inspect a flagged line before his crew arrived. Dispatch logs show he told his supervisor he would be gone 2 hours, then never returned. His truck was located with the door closed and a hard hat on the passenger seat. State records list a chainsaw missing, though archived notes differ on whether it was stored in the bed. Investigators never confirmed whether Dyer began cutting or simply walked the line. Searchers found cut branches that suggested recent work, but they couldn't tie the cuts to Dyer without tool marks. Some locals claimed they heard a distant engine, but the valley carries sound and the source wasn't verified. Investigators never confirmed a wildlife encounter, despite common assumptions in remote forestry accidents. Dispatch logs mention a steep embankment and loose rock, hazards that can swallow evidence and shift after minor rain. The case file includes a line stating no remains recovered, no definitive accident site identified. It also includes references to county file from 2009, suggesting officials still compared the earliest disappearance to the newest. Over time, the comparison became the story itself, even as the facts stayed thin. By 2019, the official records show fewer public comments and more reliance on standardized missing person language. Archive notes indicate that repeated uncertainty wears down families, volunteers, and deputies alike. Investigators never confirmed a unifying explanation, and the cases remained separate in legal terms. Some locals claimed the pattern proved something hidden, yet the paperwork reflects a more ordinary tragedy: lack of evidence. Dispatch logs, state records, and scattered archive notes create a mosaic with missing tiles, not a single clear picture. In that gap, the only consistent detail was the same sentence repeated: every victim was experienced.